Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being with us here today. My name is Yasmin Kurzi. My pronouns are she and her. I'm a Latina woman with light skin, brown hair, brown eyes, wearing glasses and a white sports coat. I'm an assistant professor at FGV Law School, Rio de Janeiro, and a postdoctoral researcher at the UVA Digital Technology for Democracy Lab, our DTD lab. Together with my colleague and mentor, Jess Reia, a professor at the UVA School of Data Science and one of the faculty leads at the UVA DTG Lab, we are organizing the Gender and Tech online talk series to discuss how gender shapes and is shaped by technologies, incorporating perspectives from the global majority. Our aim is to bring together scholars, practitioners, and advocates to explore how our work can contribute to advancing democracy and human rights. Today, we are hosting the second webinar of the series, where we aim to discuss data governance, privacy, and digital sovereignty through an intersectional lens. We are fortunate to have two amazing experts on these topics here with us, Anita Gurumurthy and Chenai Chair, who have been leading research and advocacy in India and Africa, respectively. We hope that the community we are trying to build will be another space to help us navigate the techno-authoritarian agenda that is quickly spreading in many countries. Our third webinar, titled Rethinking Platform Regulation, is scheduled for August 28, as we pause for the summer in the Northern Hemisphere. Following that, we'll have a crucial discussion on techno-capitalism and environmental justice on September 29. On October 27, we will discuss the ongoing attacks on trans rights on the webinar Visibility, Rights, and Possibilities. In late November, our final webinar will cover online queer spaces and political participation. The specific dates for fall may fluctuate, but the webinar will always occur during the last week of the month. And to conclude our series in early 2026, we will release a report that builds upon the webinar topics and our current research. For today's webinar, we recognize that English is not the first language for many of us, so please feel free to ask questions in Portuguese, Spanish, or French. We'll do our best to translate them. You can use the Q&A feature located at the bottom of the screen to ask questions. Automated closed captions are also available. We already turned them on. The recording will be available on the UVA DTD Lab YouTube's channel in the next couple of days. And thank you all again for being here. Next, we'll hear from Jess Reia, who will moderate the conversation today. Thank you, Jess.
Thank you so much, Yasmin. And hi, welcome everyone. Thanks so much for being here with us today. So my name is Jess Reia. My pronouns are they, them. I'm a Brazilian person with light skin and red hair, wearing black glasses and a dark blouse. And as Yasmin mentioned, I'm an assistant professor at UVA, also co-leading the lab. And it's a pleasure to moderate today's conversation on data governance. So the series aims to center feminist, queer, and global majority perspectives in the debate on technology, democracy, and human rights. And today's sections explores intersectional perspectives on data governance, privacy, and digital sovereignty. The discussion will focus on gender and data governance from the South and the policies that could be developed to ensure that women, gender diverse, and other historically marginalized individuals could regain control over their digital footprints and identities. And so we are very, very honored to welcome two brilliant colleagues and speakers whose work has deeply shaped these debates and our work as well, Anita Gurumurthy and Chenai Chair. And I'll read their bios respectively. Anita Gurumurthy is a founding member and executive director of IT for Change, where she leads research and advocacy on data and AI governance, platform regulation, and feminist frameworks on digital justice. She serves as an expert on various bodies, including the T20's Digital Transformation Track and the UN CSTD's Working Group on Data Governance. Anita has been part of the high-level committee of the Net Mundial Plus 10. Under Brazil's leadership, the UN Secretary-General's 10-member group on technology facilitation, and the Paris Peace Forum's working group on algorithmic governance. Anita is also a board member of global justice organizations such as the ETC Group and university centers such as the Tech and Policy Lab at the University of Western Australia. And Anita contributes regularly to academic and media space. So thanks, Anita, for being here. And Chenai Chair is a digital policy and gender expert with extensive experience in work that is focused on understanding the impact of technology in society in order to better public interest in policy. And as a 2019-2020 Mozilla Tech Policy Fellow, her project focuses on assessing the adequacy of data protection and privacy regulation in Africa, keeping in line with her objectives as a feminist researcher. Her work centers on gender and data justice perspectives. And Chenai's previous work has included research on ICT access and use, issues from a youth perspective, net neutrality, and zero rating, and unpacking the gender digital divide through a feminist perspective. So again, thank you so much for being here. We can begin with Anita Gurumurthy's remarks. So Anita, thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you. It's a pleasure and honor to be here with all of you feminists. You have showed up for a feminist lecture, and that itself is a gesture of solidarity. Thank you very much. I'm an Indian woman. My pronouns are she and her. I have black hair, and I'm wearing a colorful top with a white background. Basically, I'd like to say that the focus of my talk today is really going to be on a very important buzzword of the era, and that's about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So without ado, I will start my slide presentation. Just give me a second. Yes. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. So today I bring some reflections from our work on IT for Change India about using Southern feminist epistemologies to understand and unpack the digital revolution and its systemic ripples. So what I will do is to talk about the question of data. I'd like to focus on AI models that are quintessential data infrastructures and unpack how regimes of its production, governance, deployment, social adoption co-shape the digital order. So I have some slides, and I hope to be done by about 15 to 18 minutes. Do let me know when I have just 2 more minutes. I think that we all are very familiar with the goals of diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, which stand out as an aspiration for the data science community. Within the current logics of digital capitalism, the pursuit of diversity in data sets in the digital status quo compromises the project of social pluralism and global justice. I think this is what the larger feminist critique has been about. So my presentation will submit that there is an imperative here to challenge in toto the present institutional regime of algorithmic reason in order to unpack this regime and understand its DNA. To some extent, I would like to use the work of Cameroonian historian Achille Mbembe to discuss the infrastructures of algorithmic reason, and borrowing from a feminist cyborgian frame, I conclude with the need for radical infrastructures of cognition. So the inherent limitations of the mainstream DEI frame, or the diversity, equity, and inclusion frame, I think it's by 2025, we have enough evidence to know what distortions and discriminations are produced by AI systems in the form of exclusion of individuals from socioeconomic and cultural domains, jobs, credit, housing. And all of this results in a penalization of certain groups and communities. For instance, predictive policing is not innocent. So as AI infiltrates society, AI systems reflecting social differences begin to act as agents, and they assimilate into the logic of social organizing in such a way that bodies and places are recoded into a new system of mathematized value and rendered visible or invisible, deserving or undeserving, and so on. So the ethical inquiry of AI has grappled with how AI systems can be designed for fairness with goals of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which have emerged as a challenge to non-discriminatory and fair AI design. However, what we understand now with nearly a decade of work, especially because of sociologists who've been looking at these systems, is that in technical debiasing, using mathematical constraints on the decision outcomes of the system shows that capturing the ground truth is very hard and precision is ever elusive. So what do we mean by this? Using statistics and using mathematics to treat fairness requires categorization. It requires putting people into groups in order to express individual fairness. So we need to classify women as coming from the global south or the global north, or Hispanic women, Black women, etc. This is because there's no easy test for determining that two individuals are indeed similar. So we resort to group fairness. Group fairness, that is looking at the sum of discrimination towards an entire group rather than individual contributions, is therefore used as a proxy for individual fairness. But this presents a challenge, both of pragmatics and of ethics. A systematic review of 46 DEI guidelines for AI systems from 2015 to 2023 found that the overwhelming majority of guidance reduces DEI to a narrow technical idea rather than situate the techno-social and institutional dynamics of systems in context. This is really important because we need to really understand what is the best way to code, and is there at all a best way to code? A compelling piece of analysis by Bile and DB in 2024 argues how differences in the process of aggregation used to arrive at group fairness will lead to different outcomes given the unavoidable loss of granularity when you bunch individuals, right? You're categorizing and grouping individuals. Also, group fairness is plagued by the conundrum of fairness gerrymandering when we attempt to code for intersectional fairness. To explain this further, and of course, the professional community of coders here in this call today may understand this rather easily, determining fair outcomes for specific subgroups within a larger group is really hard. For example, let's take the instance of women and men with Arab last names. Now we can actually break this down into a number of subgroups that grows exponentially with the number of axes of discrimination. For instance, we could have subcategories for men with Arab last names, men of African descent with Arab last names, boys of African descent with Arab last names, and so on. So the more we slice and dice, we lose the ability of statistics to ensure better representation. But believe me, this is exactly what is happening in the lab that's trying to build AI. So this statistical endeavor is confronted with the mother of all questions in determining fairness. Should each group receive an equal amount of resources? Or should we try to be equitable? That is, we take into account the need and status and contribution of each group into account. So essentially, the question is, should we take a parity approach or an equalized odds approach? And to put this into an example, will the ad the advert be visible to the same rate of white women, Black women, Hispanic women? Or will the chances that the ad will not be visible be the same for all of them? So we actually have the choice to equitably put the resources, input resources, or make sure that the false negatives and false positives are the same. That is, the mistakes that are made by the system do not discriminate among the groups. Now, this is a huge task, right? Because you have to choose one way or the other in statistically grouping people. There are limits of mathematization in achieving what is inherently a social value, right? So the tech industry has continued to flirt with mathematical fixes. And this is really where the digital capitalism is lost completely in trying to bring in the prowess of statistics to completely incorrectly fix it on top of an ideology. And this ideology is a long history of Cartesian dualisms in science that overvalorizes the hyper-rational, right? We need to get it right, for which we have to keep making tweaks, and we have to keep making the statistics work through weights, give more weight to this, give more weight to that. And finally, you have a jumble that's really not fair at all. So to talk about dataism, all of this is about dataism, the idea that large data sets can offer a higher form of intelligence, a higher order insight and knowledge that was previously impossible with an aura of truth, objectivity, and accuracy. So, digital capitalism's AI models have gravitated towards modes that are averse and antithetical to social discretion, social discrimination, a form of public reason where people can determine collectively and democratically what may be priorities. What's very, very interesting is that although we know all of this, we know that we're not anywhere near getting statistics right. Even then, we are on this path. So let's take what we know about synthetic data. The use of generative AI to create synthetic data is growing very rapidly. And according to industry predictions, 60% of data for AI will be synthetic by 2024. That was last year's statistics. And it was just 1% in 2021. So this is used to simulate reality, projects future scenarios, and for the scientific pursuit to de-risk AI. And all of this is data that is manufactured. So all these technical rituals rooted in the ideology of dataism are very, very worrisome. Now we move to the second part of my presentation, which is about algorithmic reason. In our own work at IT for Change, we've grappled with the dogma of dataism, and we see it as a manifestation of the institutional regime of algorithmic reason. So this is a world where the discontents of the statistical system really confront us. Data is seen as the entire truth and a priori truth. And with the acceleration of the institutional processes of datafication, we are witness to a mathematization of the world, of forests, of nature, of the oceans, of the planet in its entirety. And this is a standing reserve. Nature is a standing reserve for techno-capitalist endeavor. So at its core, this institutional regime of algorithmic reason is a brutalist infrastructure of extraction. And this is where the lens of brutalism, which is from the studies of architecture and adapted by Cameroonian post-colonial historian Achille Mbembe, becomes useful. Our rationalities and associated arrogances have led us to a horrific place in the contemporary moment of techno-modernity. Mbembe says that brutalism is the colonially learned penetrative logic of power without external limits or an outside. Now, what are the policy approaches that we tend to adopt? Because data governance, we have to really address the question of data and AI governance. So we actually have dualistic approaches in policy, separating AI systems and the institutional environments in which they are employed, right? An infrastructural approach instead helps us understand that the geographically dispersed but computationally enveloped space, meaning that this entire thing, this entire planet and our rationalities are enveloped totally within a techno-social structure. This has multiple distributed parts. The infrastructures of algorithmic reason are situated in particular material conditions that cut through the economic, the cultural, and the political. How do we comprehend the material, immaterial, and corporeal dimensions of the infrastructural geography of AI under this kind of brutalism of modernity? So the first is the material dimension or infrastructures of plunder. The AI empire, as we know it, rests on the backs of badly paid workers toiling away, cleaning up data, labeling images, and monitoring content. And with the exponential growth of generative AI models, backed by speculative finance capital, energy use, and carbon emissions, we see skyrocketing, accentuating climate challenges for the most vulnerable. In fact, the material production networks of AI are often invisible in their full depth. And very curiously, when I read Kate Crawford and Gladden Mueller, I found that in this article called Anatomy of an AI System, both of them, the authors, actually say that one illustration of the difficulty of investigating and tracking contemporary production processes is that it took Intel, the company, more than 4 years to understand its supply line well enough to ensure that no tantalum from the Congo was in its microprocessor products. Just imagine it took them 4 years. With 19,000 suppliers in over 100 countries providing direct materials for their production and logistics, Intel's vast infrastructures of AI create a colonial dystopia. The human in the value chain must be dehumanized and disappeared into the technopolitical apparatus of AI. The logic of gigs in the platform economy normalizes a precarity that is predicated on feminized drudgery and global care chains that exploit a highly precarious, informalized, feminized, and racialized workforce. We cannot forget these material aspects, material dimensions. Now moving on to the immaterial dimensions. This, according to Membe, there are infrastructures of ignorance, right? And of course, Membe is not a commentator on technology or algorithms, but as a commentator, he brings to fore the idea that we are all guilty of perpetuating infrastructures of ignorance, keeping knowledges in very, very elite citadels. So the entire idea that the institutional regime of algorithmic reason is built on historical injustices is possible to analyze when we open up intellectual property regimes, the trade regime, the awful taxation regime, all of which are completely in favor of big tech corporations that lock up and privatize data resources. This is blatant abuse. So the unknowability of black box algorithms is in fact the privilege of not knowing that the corporate purveyors of AI arrogate to themselves, even as they unleash a disorder of societal ignorance. The third dimension is the corporeal or the bodily dimension, or infrastructures of automation. The famed prediction models from big tech are built on unrepresentative data sets proven to be racist, sexist, casteist. Membe argues that, and he talks about lost authenticity, lost spontaneity, and a lost interiority in technomodernity. And he says that social movements today are really lost because they interrogate the superficial, right? The ways, and he says that the labels of diversity and identity today become the crutches that stabilize our being through sexual, ethnic, linguistic, religious, and other axes, leaving untouched the structures of domination, the structures of sexual domination and racialization. So in this private and increasingly commodified space, where is the space for politics of feminist liberation? Tethered to presuppositions about the liberal democratic subject, our concerns and contestations unfortunately focus on individual privacy rights. And this completely obfuscates how the capitalist AI paradigm produces profit through the manipulation of identities. And, we can see also in the recent rise of authoritarian tendencies in the US that we can easily and comfortably straddle neoliberalism and neoconservatism. And this, I think, is extremely important to keep in mind. So finally, I move to the emancipatory infrastructures of cognition. What would it mean for all of us to question dataism? Well, it would mean many things. Perhaps acknowledging that a mathematical map can never excavate the full territory, right? The map is not the territory. Accepting the limits of mathematical representations of reality. So you can gerrymander your data sets as much as you want. You can slice and dice and bring more data sets to make your big data set enriched. But all of this are still representations of reality that are incomplete. Challenging dataism would mean interrogating the truth condition of AI systems, that understanding and addressing what it does in the real world in terms of social power is the most important thing. And finally, it would entail building a new cartography of AI infrastructure. So today, whether you take the EU's GDPR or, the OECD's guidelines or UNESCO's AI recommendations or the IEEE standards, you have accountability, explainability, informational openness, and fairness. Everywhere you see all the policy documents talk about why the system should be, understood and unpacked for how it behaves and why it behaved the way it did. The question we have to ask is this enough? Is all of this enough? And will it really allow us to get closer to the truth? So these institutional ethics for AI and digital capitalism run into a problem. They privilege the structures of cognition, right? You need to know a little bit more. You need to have the right to explainability, right? But they leave untouched the infrastructures of reason, of deliberation, which means that subject locations cannot be destabilized when they continue to remain hinged to digital capitalism, and society cannot aspire through a reinvented public reason to freedom, equality, and justice. So the raison d'etre, the central organizing principle, is the market, right? And that is how the international political economy is organized. And our legitimating devices for data flows are terribly narrow and distorted. We have compliance assessments for product safety, intellectual property, the right to privacy, data protection. What if we examine whether we need the product at all? Do we need that innovation? Is it innovation? How intellectual property regimes and data are not working for public authorities in the global south who need the insights, and why privacy frames simply collapse in secondary data uses. I will wind up in the next 1 minute or so, so I'm quite cognizant of time. So how do we then go about recartographing the infrastructures of AI? Here is where feminist thought is helpful. Whereas algorithmic reason underpins a syntax of social relationality that ruthlessly decouples knowledge from understanding, cyborgian thinking restores a radical visibility. The movement from the patriarchal imperial project of cognitive control to a regime of public reason that achieves agency, vitality, and dignity for all requires new modes of knowledge. And it requires us to look at references not only in terms of ontological hybridity. When we think of the cyborg, we think of this kind of a creature which is part human and part machine. But we need to go beyond this ontological hybridity to look at the experience of marginality in terms of epistemological hybridity, which means we need to problematize our understanding of a complex and unequal world, and the cyborg gives us a method to intervene and challenge the narratives of knowledge production beyond fixed ideas. So, I would like to bring back Membe, for whom the identitarian politics of fixity brings back the oppression of the colonizer. Membe notes that the human person is a compound of multiple living entities. It's not self-generating. Others are always responsible for its coming to life, and he appeals to a register of reason that can see the self not as a stable, bounded entity, but completed through an embrace of human and non-human others. So reading Membe into cyborgian strategies for a new politics of AI is to ask how the planet and its non-human life are accounted in data science. And what are our emancipatory ideals of freedom in an interdependent society of solidarity and dignity? And this is my concluding slide. And here I'd like to bring in the idea of digital sovereignty. So sovereignty is about dignity we find in freedom, but not just freedom, freedom with co-implication. Co-implication in the work of the gig workforce, co-implication in rare earth extraction in distant Congo, and a reinvention of institutions. And here we need a radicalization of data stewardship, data governance, as a means of emancipation for all, a knowledge for those located in the margins of the global political economy who are dispossessed, laboring, delegitimized, and expelled. The intersections of subordination will therefore need to be uncovered continuously to know who is most vulnerable and to tackle code as just one tool in our ethical political repertoire. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anita, for such a powerful and important presentation. I especially appreciate this discussion that data sets are not like neutral mathematical tools, and that you brought like synthetic data into this. That's kind of a promise that like privacy issues would end, as if like the data sets would be the only problems that we have to face when dealing with the dataism that you presented us. And we already have questions, but I want to move this onto Chenai. So please, Chenai, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jess. Hi, everyone in your different time zones. I'm Chenai, an African woman, dark-skinned in a gray woolen jersey with ombre, brown, and black hair. So thank you so much, Anita, for setting the scene and providing that context in terms of thinking about data and dataism. My intervention, as I was thinking about today, and particularly being in conversation with you all, was framing it from a point of thinking about data governance, resistance, and reimagining data in a datafied society. This builds up on work that I've been doing with, as part of my data rights, working with African feminists across different programs of work in terms of thinking about how we can take ownership, and also at that starting point of data as a part of us, an embodied act. It is not something that is often separate and seen outside. So I want to start by actually nuancing the context of gender on the African continent. I do not speak for the whole continent, but I will provide some examples that are country specific, and then move on to the current framing of governance and infrastructure. And these two sections start with a little bit of like sadness to them, because you often feel like, there's no hope. But I do want to leave it on a note of hope, hence the framing of resistance and reimagination, which is often feminist praxis in response to patriarchy and heteronormative stances. So to start off, on the African continent, we have amazing regional policies that really focus on uplifting people as well as holding on to human rights. So the Maputo Protocol, which is often what women refer to in terms of thinking about the rights and access that we have, actually does recognize that a large proportion of people who are still vulnerable and remain marginalized are women and also children. So this group is often seen as being at risk of being impoverished due to challenges around social and economic, cultural, and political marginalization, gender-based violence, and discrimination. And then also with work that has been done, I have been in this space for the last 10 years. And with the work that have been done, one thing is consistent, that there is a gender digital divide, as well a digital literacy gap and digital skills gap that is disproportionate towards women. And what is missing in here is that there isn't enough data around gender diversity, because that's not what's collected at the moment. And that is a challenge that exists on the African continent, which is the invisibilization of queer people. And then also in that particular context, from a gendered perspective, is the fact, which I think is across the world globally, the existent gender pay gaps. In South Africa, for example, a 2021 study, which was actually published last year, found that women in South Africa earn 78 cents for every rand by men. And this hasn't been broken down yet by gender and age, which will actually show a wider income gap. And then, of course, increased gender-based violence in the context of, in times of conflict and war. Anita mentioned the issue around DR Congo, but we have seen an escalation of conflict across the continent, which also we have seen digital technologies being used to with the internet being shut down for people to actually get assistance that they need. And so then there is an alarming rate of disproportionate impact on women and children, but also as well as queer people. Again, the issue of documentation. And then, of course, there is coming on to what we've seen, the growing anti rights, the rollback of rights, where we have discrimination towards gender diverse groups and a focus on maintaining heteronormative family values. Quite recently, there was an event that was in Kenya where people from the global north gathered to help define what a family is. And we've seen laws emerging on the African continent that are working towards criminalizing sexuality that is not heteronormative, or sexual acts that are considered ungodly. So in all of this is the context that I do want to talk about data governance from and intersecting with gender, in that most of the work that is being done and most of the assessment centers the reality of inequality that exists on the African continent. And most of the interventions have been thinking about how do we take advantage or take the opportunities that come with data and digital and data-driven technologies in order to ensure a shift in the realities of people. So the discourse that actually happens quite often on the African continent when it comes to thinking about data and digital sovereignty is really that we've got to do more when it comes to digital technologies. And so then the current discourse is about creating an enabling environment through policies and regulations, and inviting actors, international actors into the continent to set up data centers or to set up some kind of skills training initiatives. And so then the idea is that if the governance is being led, the regulation and policy making is being led by African people, then the idea is that you will have some sort of digital sovereignty connected to Pan-Africanism, where the ownership of data remains on the African continent. But in context and in practice and reality, most of the work that is being led around the regulation and policy is not really led by African entities. It is actually being funded as a matter of having the continent align with international standards. So I want to mention a few strategies and frameworks that have emerged at the continental level. So the African Union Data Policy Framework, which actually serves as a blueprint for African countries to establish data governance systems and harness data for innovation. And there are mentions of gender in this policy framework, which actually then suggests looking at increased participation. So the idea of have the numbers of people participating in the spaces of leading around data governance from a gender perspective, which I think connects to the point being raised around DEI by Anita. And then also ensuring the maintenance of human rights by actually having these data-driven technologies uplift communities. There's no further nuance, but it's a policy framework, and so that's what exists. And then also quite recently, the Continental AI Strategy that was set up in 2024, it actually also provides a framework. And I think this is actually one of the documents that talks more about gender in a larger framework, not just a binary approach of women and girls, which is already problematic. But in that understanding of governance, there's also the uplifting of the recognition of the harms that come with data-driven technologies. In this instance, the discourse is mainly around artificial intelligence, and how to ensure then that the technologies introduced actually allow for people to benefit from the system. And then also recognizing issues around safety and harms that can emerge with the adoption of artificial intelligence, and then encouraging governments to actually think about strategies that are aligned but take all of these things into consideration. And then quite recently, and this was published in 2025 at another event in Rwanda, the Africa AI Declaration, which provides guiding principles for safeguards to prevent harm and protect privacy. Again, the focus on those individual rights, ethics, transparency, and explainability. What is quite interesting around the discourse on data governance on the African continent, again, connected to the whole idea around Pan-Africanism, is the recognition of trying to emphasize data ownership and cultural identity. And this was part of a commentary that came out around the African AI Declaration, which then recognizes that Africa possesses a vast number of data sets, which sometimes, if you hear one party says we don't have data and another party says we do have data. And then also the issue around language and linguistic diversity, which a lot of focus is being on in terms of thinking about what are the data initiatives that the people are working towards. And then we also see private sector investment. So basically, I'm trying to map out the players in the data governance and how gender is thought throughout in that. So then you see the private sector ownership and infrastructure. Now, this was quite interesting that we saw one of Africa's billionaires, Strive Masiwa from Zimbabwe, who partnered with NVIDIA to build Africa's first artificial intelligence factory. And according to them, this isn't just another data center, it's a specialized powerhouse designed specifically for AI computing. Now, already that is the discourse around the infrastructure and setting up Africa to be able to compete with others. But the partners being chosen, it's quite a problematic context because we already know that NVIDIA is not does not offer cheap services. And with the emergence of DeepSeek, there were conversations of alternatives. So again, the question becomes truly who's actually benefiting from this investment, and were these the right partners? And if we're saying that there needs to be ownership on the African continent, then could this not have been done in sort of a much more clearer sense of ownership? And then lastly, we also see developmental interventions. And this is where we see a lot of gender work that's more framed from a perspective of developmental interventions. So we see intergovernmental organizations and philanthropic community actually investing into data governance models by supporting data capacity building. I think there was a recent call for a data governance, data citation call that was done by a global institution in partnership with another IGO. And then also investment in language, investment in financial technology and fintech, as a way to uplift the African continent from its state of poverty. So in all of this, when we think about gender and data governance in this wider context, the questions or the issues that have emerged from me that I have framed as concerns and questions is really firstly starting off with the framing of gender in the data governance discourse on the African continent. It still takes on a binary approach, and this also is systematic based on the language in guiding documents at a continental level that focus on women and girls. This raises the question of who is invisibilized and who is visibilized, because gender is a spectrum. And this is even beyond, as much as there's denial by some groups on the African continent that people existed as only men and women, we know historically that gender is a spectrum and so is sexuality on the continent. And then the second question emerges around who is actually driving the agenda on investing more, because we experience a form of, to borrow Anita's term, dataism, where there is a big concern towards actually harvesting more and more and more data on the African continent. And then the issue emerges, what type of governance is there? And there's really room to question, do we really need that technology? Do we really need that approach? And we've seen many projects fail because of that approach of actually just throw technology at it instead of actually completely building with community and understanding what are the needs. And the majority of times, the justification for the increased data are then to address the needs of marginalized groups. So if we have more data, we can be able to employ more young people because Africa is a younger continent. And then when you break it down by gender, it is a matter of then if we have a better fintech solution, we can see increased participation by women into the economy. 1+1 does not match in this context. The lessons are there, but I think with the hype around data, there's a refusal to engage with historical understanding. And then also the issue around who's actually creating the governance models. Again, focusing on the Brussels effect, where most people actually then take on the work that's based on a European model in actually developing the governance models. And also that's an issue around funding without really actually thinking what are the collective and community-based approaches to actually creating a governance model that does take into account the gendered realities and as well as marginalization of various groups on the continent. And then thinking about how power is maneuvered. And I think this is a discourse that's really particularly important, especially when we see billionaires getting into partnership with tech oligarchs or big tech companies, and the essence of who actually has power to determine what is the right solution when we think about governance and who is being included in the discourse. Because what we see in the gender conversation when we take on a gender perspective is the lip service inclusion, where we find a lot of women at the table, but in terms of the practical approach, it is quite limited. And then also issues around connecting to issues such as labor and the environment, where, as mentioned before, the extraction of labor, when you try to map the value chain, the data labelers on the continent being paid unfairly, even in contrast to other data labelers in Europe, and then the issues around environment, data centers being set up in areas that actually have issues around electricity as well as water, and then also some of those lands having communal meaning to them. So the question that I asked when I was thinking about this topic overall, again, in terms of data governance and gender and the intersection of it all, are Africans in marginalized contexts seen as needing to be rescued, or are we determining our future? And I think for some in the room, we know the answer is it does feel a lot like we're being rescued, less so than determining our future. So in this moment, as I go towards my wrapping up, the framework that I've been using to understand data governance from a gender perspective has really been taking on a feminist approach that allows for us to question power, to think about collective action, collaborative action, place in ethics of care and transparency. So one of the practices of resisting extractive data practices, which may allow us to shift data governance approaches, is actually really thinking about cross-sectoral collaboration. I'll give an example of an institution called NAWI that focuses on macroeconomics, but has actually worked with data labelers and also people who work on data to uplift the challenge of labor injustice and connect it to the digital rights issues as well as data governance, which allows the shift in the approach from a multiple perspective. And I think this also lends into the feminist approach of collaborative action, which is quite important to shift practice on the continent. And then also the movement from individual to community. A lot of the work that we see around data governance and data collection is around like the individual benefit. And then yet there's a need for community ownership, because often this technology is developed to help the marginalized groups, yet the marginalized groups are not part of it. So we then see institutions such as Masakane, who actually are a collaborative collection of technologists who are thinking about tech and society and language preservation, and thinking through the questions of how do they ensure that community is part of the process, and how do they also take up space, which has often been overlooked because of the identity of being African, and also ensuring that women are at the forefront of this work in a meaningful way, not just in a lip service way. And then there are also other opportunities to actually harness what is existent on the continent, such as the resolution 473 by the African Commission on Human and People's Rights to undertake a study on human and people's rights when it comes to artificial intelligence, which will also unpack misogyny and misogynoir when it comes to data practices, and also influence the data governance discourse that's currently out there. And then Also, I think it's important to connect from a South-South collaboration, where some of the initiatives on the continent are still unpacking the policy issues, whereas the work that was presented by Anita could also lend a strategy for us to think about how do we navigate the system and moving from the hyper focus on the privacy frameworks, but perhaps to radical data stewardship, which would actually be able to allow for people at different levels to think more critically about engaging with gender and data governance from that diverse perspective. And then also, lastly, to reimagine data. This work has been done by, it's been covered by myself in the last paper that I wrote for my data rights, but also Sippert from Strathmore University, where they talk about the need to actually place value on cultural data, which is often forgotten because if it cannot be categorized or it cannot be put as ones and zeros, it's not included. Yet on the African continent, that's a lot of data that's actually lost in cultural practice. And a lot of people who do hold that cultural practice are often women because of the communal existence and connection to issues. Therefore, they're not part of that data creation process and their data is not counted as being visible. So those are some of the issues that in thinking about gender and data governance, there's a need to reframe the approach and place it in a context of resistance and reimagination and borrow from work from, not necessarily borrow, but build up from work around African feminist perspectives that actually focuses on reclaiming space, reimagining, taking on the way in which things are done and responding to a heteronormative and patriarchal discourse. So that's it. Thank you so much, Jess. I'll hand back over to you.
Thanks so much, Chenai. Another powerful and very important presentation. Especially appreciate you mentioning that our frames of how we see gender are quite limited. It's still like within a binary, and I really like the questions of who is actually driving this agenda, who is creating the governance models, and you offering like ideas and possible paths on like collaboration and care. And we do have like many questions, so I will allow people to discuss this with you. And perhaps like I could start with Yasmin's question that I have here, because it's also something that it's we are struggling a lot as like in a school of data science, like trying to draw the boundaries of what data science is as practice and as a scholarship as well. And I think like you bring such important points, and I'm very happy that like we have students listening to you today as well. And the question that Yasmin shared with us is, given the epistemic and ethical limitations of dominant GI frameworks in AI that we see being questioned now, how can we rethink the training of data scientists to critically engage with the material and political dimensions of algorithmic infrastructures? And like, how can we do this from a global majority, global South perspective? I'll let you.
Chenai, I'm happy to listen to you. I'm still in that wonderful zone of having heard you, and it would be lovely to listen to you. And yeah, please go.
Thanks, Anita. So this is such an important question, and I have seen it in practice and I have seen it in theory. I think a lot of it in practice is the encouragement of curiosity by the actual creators of the knowledge for students to go into fields of sociology or for students to go into fields of anthropology. And it really starts from a younger age. To use a personal example, my nephew is going to study data science, but he's insisting on looking for a university that allows for him to also add sociology to his program. Now, on an individual level, that is his passion and that is the awareness that he needs that. On a systematic level, what is happening is that institutions are not offering these programs as part of the training institutions, right? So perhaps in all of the capacity building initiatives that are being done around science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, there's a need to include arts. And I think this work can actually be done by social justice movements so that we don't necessarily wait to be invited into the table to do the training programs, but to actually, because of the work that's already being done by social justice movements, they can actually be material and courses that can be developed for people to understand the context. Because on the African continent, a majority of young techies are building stuff and they frame it as I'm building it from my mother, I'm building it from my grandmother, without the social understanding of what does it mean to be to be a woman on the continent. And yet what they think is that they just need a literacy tool, a digital literacy tool, and then that's it. So there is a point of inter-exchange of knowledge. And then Mozilla used to run a responsible computing program where they actually, I think it was cut with the recent funds, but it's still there. But that was one of the initiatives that they got into to think about responsible computer design and connecting with institutions at a university level, at an undergrad level, so that there's an understanding of the social responsibility in building technology.
That's a great answer. Thank you.
Thanks, Chenai, and thank you, Yasmin, for that wonderful question. A few years ago, we were in this learning situation, and the facilitator of the group asked the question, do you know who employs the largest number of anthropologists in the world? So, we, started guessing, gave all kinds of answers, and it turns out to be it's the company Disney, the fellows who produce all the cartoons, right? So there's a perverse incentive here that operates to enable capitalism to become the nudge economy, right? So we unfortunately are stuck with this larger structure where the elite, the people who can understand people, the people who can understand societal relations and what really makes all of us tick, what will make us get addicted, are all being bought over by structures that are geared to hollowing out sensibilities in society. And now they are all there to hollow out democracy, right? When democracy and sensibility both are lost, I think the human race has to stop and question ourselves as to what are these technologies, that are overtaking us. So I do think that the other way to look at this, and in continuation of Chenai's presentation also, is to localize, normalize, and make AI technologies very ordinary. So you make them ordinary, you localize them, just like you introduce kids to geography and history and placemaking and sense making and understanding, chemistry in the labs and understanding pathogens in the laboratory. You introduce code and enable them to connect to all of these things critically. Now that's $1 million question or million whatever question. Where is critical thinking and how do we bring it back into our schools? So I think the first step is not to really think of a fetishized big data Silicon Valley model out there, which is the aspirational ideal, which drives the brain drain so that all the elite thinkers and students of the next generation are headed to that place. It is to normalize, to own up the technology and to make it ours in whatever rudimentary form, elementary form we want to make it. So that would then enable this kind of, decoupling of the incentives that capitalist structures providing those of us that understand social behavior from capitalist ways of production. So you need alternative ways of production where we can engage our sensibilities better. Complex answer, but I don't know how else to think of it.
No, this is great too. Thank you so much. And I think like one of the goals that Yasmin and I had when we started to put together the series is that like we can offer this kind of space to think about narratives, practice, experiences that are not necessarily like the most studied or looked at globally. And we do have like a question about this kind of like global component from Ushnish. He asked if you can, and I believe like this is for both of you as well. Can you elaborate more on the differences between the European versus African versus South Asian data governance? And what are some aspects of European and Eurocentric data governance that would cause more harm than benefit in other contexts?
I can maybe attempt to start the conversation. I think in the policy circles, particularly, there is a kind of modeling, which also serves, I think, diplomacy and the way in which people borrow ideas in the international diplomatic circles, right? You say the Europeans really respect human rights, so their models are usually about human rights. The ethics of the Chinese model are driven by different values. In Africa, it's about a certain kind of collective ideal, etc., etc. I think that somewhere we do also need to understand that very often in certain countries, large economies, Brazil, India, and others included, you might actually find that domestic digital capitalism is no different from the kind of capitalism that we're critiquing in terms of big tech and Silicon Valley. So I think even as we talk about a homegrown Asian or a homegrown African model versus a European model, which is ostensibly based on a rule of law and human rights framework, where there will be a risk assessment framework, you can tick the check boxes, and all of that. The entire idea of societal accountability and a collective modeling is still something we need to birth. It's still being born, and it really takes, I think, a critical mass of people who can reject capitalist AI models, which are monopolistic, which exploit workers, and which completely delegitimize women's claim to the society and economy. And for this, we will need to actually start thinking of these homegrown models and begin to build. So these are still early times. And as the student community, we look up to you, I think, for all of those answers in many, many ways.
I think Anita said it all. I think the only nuance in terms of like policy that a lot of critique has received from European law versus African law is around the individual versus community, which I do know that it's also a framing that needs to be taken critically because it's it's part of the Pan-African perspective and agenda, which also has its own problems from a gender dimension. But then the idea of sort of like being context agnostic and the use of language and issues that are not really based in the continent, and particularly for a lot of people working around data governance models, thinking about how do we draw from the African Charter for Human and People's Rights instead of then often picking up from like GDPR. But then that's also kind of like the power dynamic that exists in terms of if you want to participate in the global space, language sometimes has to be shared across these governance documents in order for you to participate. And again, as Anita points out, really thinking about how do we create it from a homegrown perspective, which does raise the question of power, because we do know right now, as much as Nigeria does have a similar, I think, GDPR law, they find faith Meta, and it's all up in the air whether Meta will pay or not, because again, that is a power dynamic of will they or won't they based on location.
Thank you so much. And I think we also have questions thinking about the role of big tech companies and like platforms that are transnational, operate in different territories with different values, sometimes like not, or really often not really aligned with digital rights principles or other more like international advocacy efforts. And then we have two questions. One, it's for Anita more, and the other for Chenai. I'll read both, but like feel free to comment on whichever you prefer. So Wolfgang asked Anita, this person wants to inquire further about your point on the increased range of training on synthetic data and the risks of increased bias in those models. What are some ways you would suggest detecting or addressing bias in this synthetic training data? And then Chenai, we got a question about if you or like your network is considering mapping the presence of foreign big techs in the African continent for research purpose and investigating if and how their governance model infrastructure tackle intersectional issues or manifest this. And please feel free to comment on one or both questions. Well, it's yours.
I'm not a technical person. I'm not trained in data science, but I attempt this answer from a more intuitive sociological perspective. So I think that the entire idea of getting good quality data, usually we hear this from data scientists in Google and all those big companies, and I would still think that even public authorities, who work in agriculture, in health, in delivery of public education, are concerned about extremely good quality data. Now, that is a lot of hard work, right? You digitize those systems and you make sure that the data is really rich and it's possible to replicate. It is possible to become the base layer through which synthetic data is generated. So I think finally the solution is to enable AI systems or AI ecosystems to be smaller, more localized, rather than rely on the idea that big is beautiful. So I do think that the technical answer to the synthetic data question would perhaps come from someone who is a data scientist. But from me, I do think that the conundrums that haunt us in terms of how do you get it right is basically, at the base level, a question about what is a good data ecosystem? Does that have to be large, right? Do you need synthetic data? And so who should actually be putting public financing behind these data sets? Who should actually finance these data sets? And I strongly feel that public authorities must own this up, especially, but you don't have to have ownership models that are state controlled. You could actually have ownership models that are more complex, where community controls can be exercised. So I would essentially argue for systems that are smaller, systems where accountability relationships are easier to establish, where liability, where the buck stops somewhere, right? Today, we don't know where the buck stops. Sorry about it. I am really not qualified to answer the question in quite the way it was asked.
Thanks. That was a great answer. Chenai?
So I'll answer directly my question. So no, I haven't thought about doing that project, but just to plug that where my data rights now is really conceptualizing that collaborative work that can take on like practical examples, because that's a big thing that's missing on the African continent in terms of thinking about these intersectional issues. So would be very happy to connect and think about how it can be done and make it a collaborative project that is owned by multiple people, which I think does allow for a greater intervention. And even not just like with the foreign big techs, but even take it in a localized perspective, because I really like what Anita said about like domestic capitalism that's taking place, where oftentimes when you are in a marginalized context, we often focus on big tech and the harm that they're doing, but actually there is harm that is being done with domestic capitalism. And I think particularly around data, it's really driven by big financial institutions that have existed, colonial times. So the data that they do hold is quite biased and problematic, but in terms of actually accountability mechanisms and tracking the impact of their governance models, that is a gap that needs to be filled. So yeah, we'd be happy to connect and talk further.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks, Valeria, for the question. Well, we have another one here. And I feel like both of you mentioned some ideas and some kind of like paths forward. But Andre is asking, he says first, like in science and technology studies, no data is considered natural, pre-existing, or imbued with special properties. And our data-driven obsession often confuses data maps with physical territories and representation with reality. And then two questions. One's as if how does this computational authority originates, or how do you deal with this? And the other one, what kinds of social resistance movements can expose the facade of rationality projected by big data companies and their products as well? I think like you gave us examples, but like if you want to develop a little bit further, that would be great.
I think it's good to have resistance in the classroom to all these big models. Certainly a place that we cherish and preserve, considering the fall of the university in almost all jurisdictions. I can't tell you, I spend sleepless nights because students are not able to think for themselves. And, it's really, we are under siege as a society, we are under siege that the society I grew up in would allow us to question authority. And of course, I'm not meandering. I'm actually contextualizing this to say that to question this kind of a computational authority, as you put it, Andre, is really is really no different from questioning hegemony in any other sense. The unfortunate thing is that the political and economic forces have come together today such that economic forces want to do politics, right? So political power is completely taken over by those controlling the economy. And this kind of insufferable collusion between the two is really, I think, the beginning of the end. And therefore, there's no other way this can be addressed other than by a kind of a straightforward resistance. And today, I read an article which actually said that the penalization, of the public prosecutor of the International Criminal Court on account of the fact that the government in the United States had decided that the International Criminal Court should not really operate, meant that the infrastructural services being provided by one company to the International Criminal Court was withdrawn. So this large near-monopoly organization withdrew from the International Criminal Court. Can you imagine? This is the infrastructure of the world, the International Criminal Court, war crimes, right? So they are left with no email, no cloud. Ooh. So in some sense, it's mind-blowing. It's in another sense, it's really, the writing on the wall with respect to what resistances we need to reclaim our infrastructures. I would really say that this is about everything. It's about water, it's about identity, it's about our forests, it's about many things, and it's not only computational.
Yep. 100% agree to infinity. I think even when I think about like resistance practices that I've seen that have been rising up, it is really led by people who are already working on a social justice issue. So the example I gave around labor, and so then that cross-collaborative movement of working with data labelers, going back to that like historical context of how labor has shifted, what played a particular role in kind of like the independence on the African continent, but also championing for that change, and also the intersection with like the youth movement, because a lot of people who are data labelers are young people, but also in highly precarious economic positions. So it is that organization around what people would call a bread and butter issue, and connecting it to the digital rights issues, connecting it to ecofeminism, connecting it to labor justice. And I think that is part of that resistance mapping, and perhaps a call to people on this call that even in your different disciplinary fields, really do think about how you're cross connecting to the issues, and not necessarily say, because I'm not an expert on anthropology, I cannot contribute with my computational understanding. Yet that is what is actually needed to spare on the resistance, because people do rely on like people saying it's too complex and I don't want to engage. Because that case of ICC, for many years, we've been talking about people owning their own infrastructure. Like, just don't rely on having your company website on Meta, because when it goes down, you don't have access. It's things that were already there. So one wonders why we're still caught up in this space where even at our most highest level of digital literacy and highest level of digital skills, we still learned ourselves to be reliant completely on this one platform. Yet resistance would look like actually thinking about having multiple ways to stay connected, not just through one platform.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we're at time, and I want to say thank you, Anita and Chenai, for the excellent discussion, for your time and knowledge sharing. Really appreciate it. Gratitude to everyone who showed up. And we know we have more questions. We are collecting them, and we'll do our best to address some of those questions in the report. So please mark your calendars for the upcoming webinar. Now we take a break over the summer in the Northern Hemisphere, and we come back on August 28th, and we'll provide more details shortly. I shared the newsletter from the lab if you want to like keep in touch and learn more about the upcoming events and when the report comes out. And so take care and see you next time. Thank you so much.